Scuba diving can be one of the most daring professions of all time, and expert scuba divers take more depths into some unexplored parts of the ocean that seem deadly, or even among some of the scariest places on planet Earth. I'm going to give a breakdown of the terrible Jacob's Well tragedy that happened to Richard Patton and Clark McConnell. They were both students at Texas State San Marcos University, trying to get a certification, an instructor certificate to be precise, in open water diving. Just as many of us try to get several certifications to boost our career progress and versatility in various fields, they were also trying to get the certification in that vein. Texas State University offered this advanced diving course. The tragedy struck in November 1983. While Richard Patton and Clark McConnell were students of this course, they had a master diving instructor known as Don Dibble. Don was known as a rescue diver with Hays County and was also a Navy diver. On top of all that, he also owned a local dive shop close by and had many years of advanced diving experience. His portfolio says a lot about him and why he was the one leading this class to get certified as an advanced diving instructor. Don was a veteran when it came to diving, with a lot of experience gathered over the years. He knew that some things are pretty daring about the job, but you have to be careful and cautious. This was something he always advised his students, to balance safety with the drive to explore. His major instruction to his students was to stay away from Jacob's Well, as it has become a mini Bermuda Triangle, or we could call it a Bermuda Sphere, which took the lives of scuba divers daring this expedition. It was just 30 minutes away. As I mentioned before, one wouldn't know that there was more space to be explored beyond the 25-feet well that was visible. Once cave divers figured this out, they would outrightly start exploring the well. This exploration led to the identification of 3 chambers under the main well, segmented by the explorers. Similar to a funnel, the first 2 chambers were pretty open and large enough for a person to pass through conveniently. Meanwhile, the 3rd segmented chamber had a very small opening, making it very challenging for anyone to pass through easily. But once they could get through that, the diver entered a room that was almost 10 feet tall, with some trapped air in the narrow peak-like opening at the top. Then, at the far edge of the 3rd segmented chamber, a tiny hole not big enough to push through was nearly visible near the floor. The urge and the calling to explore further and find out what was beyond that last part was a temptation most divers fell for. The majority of them were always trying to move the granite and the rocks away to get to the other unexplored side. While Jacob's Well is an amazingly beautiful recreational environment with crystal clear waters, it's transparent enough to reveal a deep hole in the very shallow river which people can walk and play around. Many swimmers who come to relax take a free dive down to the bottom of the hole, measured to be around 25 feet, then hurriedly swim back to the top. The bottom of the hole is a beautiful sight to behold. Talking about blue holes, this particular hole looks like it ends at 25 feet, but in reality, that's not the case. It's a pretty deceiving wedge because, at the end of the hole, slightly to the corner, is the actual Jacob's Well. This leads to a slope that takes you into an underwater chamber, like a bat cave or an Aquaman lair. If you don't get close enough, you might not realize that there is more lying at the end of the 25-feet well than just the 25 feet. Don Dibble had ultimately done his very best to help save these divers from themselves. At this point, Don would have screamed, "Are you guys nuts?" because he was trying to rescue them, and they were so hell-bent on risking their lives. But right now, he was just trying to instruct divers to stay away from these underwater caves. Unfortunately, students Richard and Clark saw a sense of interest and expedition levels rising to 1000% in the warnings of their instructor. They heard about his body recovery missions and his own near-death experience in the 4th chamber, which made him tell people to stay far away from it. Don was trying to enter the 4th chamber out of the curiosity all these men posed together. Then an unexpected gravel slide trapped him in the tiny, narrow crawl space. Both of Don's arms were pinned, so he was handicapped at that point and couldn't even pull on the safety line or get attention from his team members. After several minutes, Don had given up, already accepting the fact that he was a dead man, knowing that he could not move and his oxygen would be gone in barely a minute or 2. He felt a severe, eerie sense of calmness and composure, knowing that, well, this is it. His tank was empty, and he had started swallowing some water too. It was deep in that moment that he had a burst of survival instinct. He started thrashing and kicking all around and managed to clear enough gravel to push backward and come out. He backed out of the tunnel and saw his partner there with his regulator, giving it to him to breathe. Don gasped wildly in the air, swallowing some of the water as he inhaled. At that point, he was desperate for anything. High survival instincts kicked in, and this, my people, is why I can't be a diver. Oh well. The incredible fear he felt before had been compressed into relief at just being alive. But that relief was minute as he started moving up through the chambers, coming out of Jacob's hole. The pain of the expanding air in his stomach became constantly hurtpful. His diving partner's air supply was almost exhausted, so they had to keep moving up fast to get out of the water. Air is compressed under 58 psi, or at about 4 atmospheres of pressure, at a depth of approximately 100 feet. As he moved up continually, the air in his body expanded to 4 times the volume it was at the bottom chamber. By the time Don reached the surface of the hole, he looked as if he was 9 months pregnant. He was lamenting in pain because his stomach had completely ruptured. It wasn't long before Don Dibble, the instructor for Texas State University, was asked to help recover the bodies of 2 men from Jacob's Well. These men were Kent Mopin and Mark Marasher, who managed to enter the 4th chamber, but sadly couldn't make it out and died there. The gravel managed to cave in the little tight space connecting to the final segment. The divers had to eventually squeeze their bodies through the tunnel that was scaled at about 2 feet in diameter. After the men had passed through the tunnel, there was likely a rock slide of gravel and stones that filled the narrow tube they struggled to pass. They would have been trying to clear out the gravel and the stones that caved them in, but they most likely ran out of time because the time was limited and the oxygen diminished. The team expected to clear out the body was not able to clear the proposed gravel landslide, preventing them from getting to Kent and Mark's bodies. Eventually, Mark's body was washed out by current in 1981, while Kent's body remained in the 4th chamber for the next 20 years. Don was pretty tired and upset about the number of lives that were getting lost in an elusive effort to get to that 4th chamber. As a result, in January 1980, Don took cement and a couple of rebar down there to try to cover up the small hole that made divers feel like they could make it, thereby blocking the passageway into the 4th chamber. He left bars in the middle, giving way for the water to continue to flow. It might seem that would probably be the end of the Operation Get to the 4th Chamber saga, but it turns out it was way more than that. Not long after, only months later, some divers got there, pulled out the cement and the bars, and left a note on a kind of plastic slate saying, "You can't keep us out." Don never stopped mentioning these desperate moments when he almost lost his life in attempts to warn his students. He focused his attention on his students because the divers were generally being stubborn. He was trying to warn them of how even instructors and experienced divers can be surprised inside an underwater cave due to its unpredictable movements and changes. Anything could cause it to collapse on itself. Regardless of all the warnings passed on to these students, Richard and Clark felt like it was quite an adventurous journey to, take a look at this forbidden cave. But the problem with this expedition was that these 2 experienced scuba divers were not just going diving, they were going cave diving. Diving and cave diving are 2 separate activities, each with its own additional risks and rules. The conviction that comes with problem solving in diving might not help at all because this was cave diving. There are specified rules and additional equipment and measures required in cave diving. They had no idea to bring a safety line to clearly mark the path back, and unfortunately, this was the undoing of the tragedy that befell these individuals. They also weren't experienced in any way in frog kicking to keep the silt and fog from being disturbed along the walls and bottom of a cave. The most important difference is that just going up won't bring you closer to safety. Open water divers can follow the bubbles or even the light to the surface, but cave divers cannot do that. So, the D-Day. It was Wednesday night before the Thanksgiving holiday when Richard and Clark decided they would make their way into Jacob's Well at about 8:30 p.m. They navigated through the main well of 25 feet and the first chambers without any issues. As they moved on to enter the 3rd chamber, it dawned on them that the stories and warnings of Instructor Don were actually serious, and they began to feel endangered. Once their bodies were squeezed through the tight juncture, the risk level increased rapidly, because at that point, anything could happen. A quick swim to the top wouldn't be possible. If there was a problem with their gadgets, they would be trapped in a tight space that would require a slow and well-calculated exit. These men knew they faced death as time went on. The 2 men were both scared, but they still pressed on eagerly, awaiting the next phase they would reach. They approached the small hole that led to the 4th chamber. Richard and Clark began removing their tanks because they would need to push the tanks through the hole separately, while they focused on squeezing their bodies through the tiny passage. Richard managed to push himself through the tunnel, while Clark waited for Richard to get through before attempting to cross. Clark waited a few minutes to allow Richard to pass through the tiny hole. Then he started removing his own tank to make it through. As he moved towards the opening, he saw the face of his friend visibly with a frantic expression of struggle. Richard passed through the hole with force, hitting his body on the rocks of the cave. Suddenly, Clark realized Richard had no air tank and was barely holding his breath. He was suffocating. Clark then grabbed his own regulator and gave it to Richard so he could breathe. After a short while, they both started buddy breathing, passing the regulator back and forth while they tried to move out of the cave and towards the entrance of Jacob's well. It took a huge amount of trust, calmness, and patience to squeeze back through the tiny passageway between chambers 2 and 3, as it required the most delicate coordination and cooperation. In a desperate struggle for breath, and with both men fighting for their lives, they took turns sharing the regulator. As one man ran out of breath, he would pass it to the other, and they followed this routine while moving through the tiny space and trying to figure out the way out, since they hadn't properly mapped their way in. Richard and Clark made their way into the first chamber with some level of relief, thinking they were close to the exit, which gave them hope. It was really dark outside, as it was late, so there was no sunbeam to guide them to the surface of the main well, and they couldn't see anything. They were just moving up. Maps and descriptions of tunnels can be very deceiving. The passages aren't always straight and smooth. They are jagged and irregular, making it very difficult to maneuver around and easy to become disoriented and confused. They were moving slowly because of the shared air tank, but were still making their way up the wall to the exit of the first chamber. As they continued moving, a sound halted their progress. Their tank hit something and made a hollow clank, signifying two things. The tank was empty, and they had just hit a ceiling. With no oxygen left, it was clear they were certain for doom. They tried moving left and right, feeling the ceiling and walls around them. The realization brought forth a panic that couldn't be contained. They were trapped, and had just taken their last breath of air. Clark took a long draw of breath, and then knew the tank was empty. Richard was staring, already on one breath hold, feeling his way around the ceiling trying to find an opening of any sort. Clark remembered that this was the false chimney in the first chamber. A false chimney is a tunnel inside a cave that appears to lead to the surface, but is actually a dead end. In a last-ditch effort, Clark pushed off the wall, back the way they came for about 20 feet, and re-entered the first chamber, still on one breath. It was almost 25 feet, to the top of this chamber, and another 25 feet, through to the main well to get to the surface. Clark then pierced the surface of the water and made a desperate gasp for air, feeling a relief of freedom after swimming a frantic 75 feet. On a single breath hold, he was relieved to be alive. It was a miracle, and he was happy. However, happiness gave way to terror for Clark as he remembered that, although he was out of the water, his companion Richard was still in there. Clark waited a few moments to see if Richard might somehow float to the surface before calling the police for assistance. Don received a call for diver rescue and arrived at Jacob's well within an hour. He was taken aback to discover that it was two of his students involved in the incident. Despite being expert divers, cave diving was a very different challenge. The lower chambers were all silted out, so recovery efforts had to wait until the next morning. It was clear that Richard was trapped in the false chimney, a dead end disguised as a passage to the surface, and the lack of oxygen ensured his swift demise. Clark then explained where Richard's body could be found, and Don helped recover it the next day. Despite Don's continued warnings and attempts to block access to the dreaded fourth chamber, another life was taken again in Jacob's well about a year later. Humans are so stubborn. Nothing can stop them, not even the fear of death. Wayne Russell died in the fourth chamber while diving with his friends, and Don was again called to recover a body. If I were Don, I would have been disheartened by the lack of heed. In the long run, Don's goal of restricting access to the dangerous chambers was realized. Hard measures were put in place to stop people from venturing in. The Hays County Parks Department then authorized one group to explore Jacob's well past the 40 feet depth point. The Jacob's Well Exploration Project has since then conducted extensive exploration of the cave system. A new grate has been installed at the 40 feet mark, and all recreational scuba diving is now prohibited in that area. It has been estimated that at least 8 and possibly as many as 12 people have lost their lives diving in Jacob's Well.